Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Carol. And thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to our funders, and thanks to the National Network folks who are making this happen. Carol stole all my best lines. So Carol started by saying, it's good to be here. This is like a family reunion. And let me echo that. And I'm going to meditate on the state of our work and our field for the next 45 minutes and lead to a point that is going to argue that family reunion is even more profound than we usually think it is. So we do these conferences every 2 years, and they mean a lot to us. We take them very seriously. We don't want just to have a conference and a bunch of panels. We want to move the work along in very deliberate ways. And we were well into the planning for this one, where you are right now, when one of the National Network folks said, we should do something special this year. It is the 10th anniversary of the National Network. This was news to me. I had not realized this. I was very glad that it was pointed out because he was right. We should note it and we should observe it. I was maybe more seriously pleased to have it pointed out because if you do this kind of work, you all know that one does not spend a lot of time thinking about where you've been and how you've gotten here and how well things have gone. We don't spend a lot of time celebrating. And I think that is most centrally because if you do the kind of work that we do, and if you are committed to public safety, particularly as Carol said, we are around the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable places, that in practice means that you have committed yourself to failure. What we do is never good enough. There's always more work to be done than has been done. This is grueling, grinding, and in many ways fundamentally awful work that we do, which has hidden from me, certainly, something that this chance to reflect not just on 10 years of the National Network, but the last couple of decades in our field. Because I think without fully realizing it and honoring it and building on it, the fact is that there is now a science and practice of violence prevention in a way that not long ago there wasn't. We're calling this conference, our theme for the conference is the emerging science of violence prevention. I wanted it to be the emerging science and practice of violence prevention, but my folks rightly pointed out that was really long. I got it restored for this talk, right? So my 45 minutes here is the emerging science and practice in violence prevention. And when my folk said this is the 10-year anniversary of the National Network and we should pay attention to that, it gave me, anyway, a chance to step out of the awful, never adequate work that is public safety and make note of that profound fact. So everybody in our world now talks about things that are evidence-based, right? So evidence-based means the social science says, according to rigorous standards accepted by what are supposed to be, when we say those articles go through peer review. They don't go through peer review. They don't go through the review of my peers in this room. They go through other folks who have said that they are going to be the gatekeepers of what works and what doesn't, which does not mean they're not worthy of respect, because they are. But that world has said there are things that by the highest standards of social science we know work to prevent violence. And it is a relatively small but very important portfolio. So Carol talked about the group violence intervention, which is one of what's called focused deterrence. We know that street outreach can prevent violence. We know that certain kinds of outreach and support can prevent violence. We know that hospital-based violence prevention initiatives can prevent violence. We know that hotspots policing can prevent violence. We know that we can make communities safer and work with communities to be safer. That statement that we know we can do this, that's a new statement. Not long ago, that was not true. So Carol said the 90s don't seem that long ago. I began my field work in these issues, and my first boots on the ground were in Los Angeles in 1985, as crack had fully taken hold in that part of Southern California and was sweeping east. And people were dying at unconscionable rates in LA in 1985. And at that time, the official position of the Los Angeles Police Department was that it could not do anything about people killing each other. And in the perspective of the time, that made perfect sense. The LAPD at the time patrolled, it answered rapid response calls, it answered 911 calls, and it did retrospective detective investigations. And you can't patrol against homicide. It happens too quickly. It happens inside. By the time you get the 911 call, it's over and it's too late. And even in Southern California, most killers are not serial killers. And if you clear the last one, you haven't done too much to prevent the next one. So LAPD said we can do things about robbery and burglary and car theft and that kind of thing. There is nothing we can do about homicide and gun violence, and we are not going to hold ourselves accountable for it. That's not true anymore. We know now that this is work that we can do. We are going to hear in a minute from Reagan Cunningham from Oakland. And Oakland is properly making headlines all across the country. There's a wonderful Giffords report that's just come out on Oakland. And not to steal Reagan's headline, because this is other headlines. Over 5 years or so, Oakland has cut homicide and gun violence roughly in half, arrests roughly in half, and police use of force, complaints against the police, and the clearance rate has gone from under 30% to over 70%. City of Oakland did that. We work in Detroit, and Detroit last year saw record homicide lows. This is work we can do in Oakland, in Detroit, places that people had given up on not long ago. My office is working in the small up Hudson town of Newburgh. And 30,000 people, not Oakland, not Detroit, but pound for pound, consistently one of the 10 most dangerous jurisdictions in the United States. And the first year that they were operating, this is the Newburgh folks, they cut they combine homicides and non-fatal gun woundings. They cut what they call bullet-to-body shootings by about 70%. And the next year they cut it by about another 70%. This is work we now know how to do. And if I didn't have anything else to say today, if this was the end of this part of the program, I would consider that an incredible victory. And I want all of you to recognize what you have done. And I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but the fact is that this breakthrough, this incredible accomplishment in the lives of communities in the United States, and Carol's right, other places are now learning from this. That breakthrough has been produced by the people in this room. And those you work with, and your professional communities, and your networks, and all of those like you who show up every day knowing that what is going on out there is not okay and determined to do something about it. And this world has created this extraordinary accomplishment. Can I have a round of applause? So that's the first thing I wanted to say today. Here's the second. And that is that as I began, I don't think that even we pay enough attention to the fact that the world has changed in this regard. I know that the outside world has not recognized this in the way that it should. It's changing. And one of the groups that we've put together over the next couple of days will talk about the ways in which especially state government and local government is recognizing this new reality and backing it and building it into their daily work. So there is progress, but it's not where it should be, and it's as common still for people facing homicide problems to say we don't know what to do, or we looked at that thing they did and they're different and it won't work here, right? We have not won that battle yet, although we're making headway. And I think one of the reasons is because those of us who do this work are busy and exhausted, and we focus on the things that have not been done, which is as it should be. But I think there's another reason. And I think another reason is that this science and practice of violence prevention has not emerged as a science and practice. It has emerged as a range and succession of models. And we're all familiar with the different models, and sometimes they're associated special vocabularies, and sometimes they're associated special brandings, and even sometimes the persons and personalities that are associated with them. But we have not ourselves, much less to the outside world, presented the work that we do as the work that we do. It has been divided and separated. And I had my face rubbed in this a few years ago. I was asked to be part of a panel talking about this new world of practice at an annual gun control conference in Washington, D.C. And this was the world of traditional gun control, focused on statute and legislation, which is critically important stuff. But that's not a world that is so much familiar with the day-to-day kind of work that folks in this room do. And this is how I think of our work. There are lots of things that can affect violence. But the work that I've been part of and the National Network is focused on, and that I know many of you are focused on, is what do we do right now? All right, whatever's left over after all the other good work has been done, and it's never perfect, and people are at risk. What do we do now? And that is this increasingly powerful world of practice that has emerged. And the organizer for the panel was doing prep work, and I was on the phone, and the organizer said, "David, would you begin the panel by talking about the differences between the models? I don't think everybody understands the differences." And I had this spasmodic reaction, and I remember literally saying on the phone, I was lying on the bed in my bedroom, and I said on the phone, "Please don't make me do that." And that immediate response was very personal. And it was my being sick of the models and the elbows out and the competition and the specialized vocabularies and all of that. I had just had it with that. That was not a very sophisticated response. What it sort of woke up in me, and what I've been dwelling on a lot since then, is that if you are close enough to what works, I think there is, in fact, a way to look at it that is unifying. And so that's the second thing I want to talk about. So if you are close enough to all the different things that work, they all vector off what has become the single, so far, absolutely consistent and transformative fact on the ground, which is homicide and gun violence and lots of other serious issues that fundamentally threaten the fabric and well-being of communities are driven by very, very small numbers of high-risk people. And my friend here is nodding, because if you do this, you know that that's right. So Carol talked about the Boston Project. We were taught this by frontline folks in Boston. We had the research skills to build on what they already knew. We did that work. And in Boston in 1995, it was 1% of the young men who were associated with the groups that were driving both victimization and offending. 1% of that age cohort. As we went through and as others went through, everybody in this room knows this now because we see it over and over and over again. It's in any place, it's about 0.5%. That high risk 0.5% will be consistently connected with 50, 60, 70, 80% of all the homicides and gun violence. There hasn't been a place in 25 years where people have asked that question where that hasn't been true. It's just the way it works. And that fact alone is transformative. It ripples through everything. And I'm going to come back to what some of its implications for communities are. But if you know that that's right, then we know that zero tolerance is wrong, right? If we know that that's right, and it is, then we know that those are the folks that we should focus on keeping alive and free. We're in New York City right now. New York City, not that long ago, was telling the world that zero tolerance, stop, question, and frisk was the necessary way to prevent serious violent crime. 5 or 6 years ago, there was essentially a political referendum on this. The city said, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. NYPD says stops in New York City are down over 95%. And last year's homicide count was the lowest number since people started keeping statistics in New York City. And we're going to be honored tomorrow with the presence of acting NYPD Commissioner Benjamin Tucker. He's filling in this week for Commissioner of NYPD, James O'Neill. When the top of NYPD talk about their policing strategy, Jimmy O'Neill and everybody else begins now by saying, we have a small number of high-risk people and our guiding principle is precision policing. And they're doing their version of ceasefire. They're working with the Mayor's Office of Gun Violence Prevention. They're doing outreach. They're doing an awful lot of things in New York City. The good news in New York City is not an accident. But the NYPD and its 35,000 people now operate on the principle that there is a small number of high-risk people in the community, and we can tell who they are, and we can pay them a special kind of attention. And everything that works in violence prevention begins with that fact, whether it's street outreach or focused deterrence or hospital-based. Turns out that having somebody walk into your hospital and survive a gunshot wound is an extraordinarily good way of knowing they're a high-risk person, right? That's a clue. And then we know that and we can do things. But everything that works vectors off that key fact. And then again, if you're familiar enough with what works, there's a relatively small number of extraordinarily important things that we have learned how to do. We know how to identify those folks, and if the focused deterrence stuff does it with incident reviews and shooting reviews, and Andy Papachristos does it with social network analysis, and outreach workers do it because they know who they are, right? It's still the same basic function. We are identifying those folks. Everything that works builds relationships, figures out how to communicate, figures out how to sustain contact with those high-risk folks because they're special and they need a lot of care and attention. And you can't affect violence without being in relationship and supporting and affecting the behavior of those high-risk people. Everything that works knows that those folks have been themselves extraordinarily victimized. If they're still walking around, they're not dead. But a lot of them aren't walking around because they didn't make it. And those who are walking around, their friends are dead, their families have been hurt, they've survived that, they've witnessed extraordinary levels of violence, they are traumatized, and paying attention and doing everything possible to respect that victimization and fear and risk and to keep them safe, that's the work. Everything that works is very, very careful and entrepreneurial about what it takes to offer that outreach and support. It used to be that everything was needs assessment and a job referral and a GED referral, and we all know that doesn't work. Not at the beginning, at least. People need to be protected from their enemies. They need food on the table. They need help with their wants and warrants and child support. They need a driver's license. They may need food for their younger brothers and sisters because they can't think straight. But everything that works very hard to offer that outreach and support. Everything that works tries to interrupt and disrupt the street dynamic. So we know the violence proceeds through vendetta and retaliation and through the carrying of the street norms that say if I'm disrespected, I have to hurt you, and the enemy of my friend is my enemy. And those are ideas, and they shape behavior, and they are actions, and they can be identified, and everything that works tries to interrupt those dynamics. And a credible messenger who's doing rumor control is not the same as a police officer who's doing a custom notification. But they're both trying to do the same thing. They're trying to stop that next shooting. Everything that works tries to mobilize informal social control, right? So the power of mothers and grandmothers and fathers and coaches and the right kind of faith leaders and the right kind of community elders in relationship with the high-risk folks to say, we do not want this, we do want that, is tremendously powerful. And everything that works tries to mobilize and focus that. Not everybody works with law enforcement, right? This is not a unified community, although the fact is law enforcement's always in the air. There is no place this is going on where there isn't any policing, right? That's just a fact. But lots of these approaches do work very closely with law enforcement. And where that's true, we're doing everything we can to replace enforcement with deterrence. Right? We don't want to put hands on people and lock them up, and if we can tell them what their risks are and that gets them to stand down, that's a victory. And everybody that's doing this, including the very best folks in law enforcement, want as little law enforcement as we know how to do. And as we were putting this year's conference together and had the flip chart paper on the wall and were structuring the panels and the speakers and such, we looked at each other and we said, there are a whole lot fewer cops here than there would have been a few years ago. And that's true. And that's not because law enforcement isn't interested, right? Law enforcement is still very present. But the non-law enforcement capacity and expertise in this work is getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and that's what everybody wants. And then this stuff is work that real people have to do, and so everybody who does this works to structure it and manage it and administer it and keep it on track and institutionalize it. And the emerging science and practice of violence prevention, I think, looks something like that. That's what we're all doing. And we haven't looked at it like that. We have looked at it as programs and particular initiatives and projects and such. But I think there's a case to be made that there can be a field and a science and a practice that looks something like that. And if that's right, then we may be able to build on the extraordinary work and progress that has brought us to this point and bootstrap ourselves to a place of even greater focus and capacity and effectiveness. I've convinced myself that that's right, and the National Network is going to be working on that. I'm hoping that that makes sense to all of you and that we can do this together, because I am optimistic that this is the next stage in our journey. So I want to be very careful in what I say next, because we all have and should draw inspiration and support and find friends and colleagues in all sorts of different places. And I don't want anything I'm about to say to sound otherwise. But as I look at how we've gotten where we are, it's always been the case that the new ideas and the new practice and the new insights and the work on the ground that has proved that we can do this, it has come from the bottom up. It has come from the front lines, it has come from the streets, it has come from the affected communities. It has found homes in, and it has found support from larger institutions and fields. And again, I think that's as it should be. But I want to make the following observation, which is that criminal justice and policing and criminal justice and criminology, those have all been around for a very long time. Realizing that there was only a small number of high-risk people and that they were as much scared as they were predatory, and that they would listen to their grandmothers, and that deterrence could mean sitting down in a church and talking to them respectfully. That didn't come from the departments of criminology and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It came from desperate frontline folks in Boston over 20 years ago. The fact that gang is a terrible way to think about groups of high-risk people did not come from gang scholarship. It came from the front lines, and unfortunately gang scholarship still hasn't quite caught up with this reality. There have been social services and social work for a very long time. And I said a minute ago, up until fairly recently, that meant offering people GED and job placement. The realization that that does not work, and that we need to offer people the big, small stuff, and that peer support and peer intervention is as or more important than the professionals, and that giving people referrals doesn't work, and you have to relentlessly find people, and that they will fail and fail and fail, and not keeping their job for a specified 6-week placement does not mean program failure. It just means that they're engaged. And the attention to the unbelievable trauma and the beginning of figuring out how to respect and address that trauma, that did not come from the schools of social work. It came from Deanne Hoskins in Cincinnati. It came from Fatima Mohammed. It came from Devon Bogan. It came from Osborne and Fortune and church basements all over the country. And it is changing that practice, but it started at the ground. Medicine and epidemiology have been around for a long time. Street outreach came from the streets of Harlem almost 60 years ago. And then from Boston and Chicago and LA. And there has been government for a long time. And we are about to hear the extraordinary success story that is Oakland. But the fact is, Oakland is a success story after government and appointed and elected officials in Oakland blew it over and over and over and over again. And that didn't change until Oakland United and the PICO, National PICO Network organized communities in Oakland and said, you don't get to mess this up again, you have to do it right. And made sure that that happened. So we should find partnership and homes wherever we see fit. I really believe that. But where the big institutions and the big fields pick up on the work that the people in this room and your friends and colleagues have created, I at least want them to recognize that that heavy lifting and that sleeplessness and that grinding commitment to doing something came from you, and they're learning from it. And if we were to have something that we could more or less agree on as a science and practice of violence prevention, I'm not so sure that we wouldn't want to look at those worlds and say, you know what? We're not doing your model. You're doing our model. Because I think that's actually what's happening. I want to say one final thing, and that is we now know that there is a very small number of high-risk people in any place. We should recognize and celebrate that what that means is that the way so many people have thought about the affected communities is wrong. So I was raised on, oh, those are dangerous neighborhoods. I grew up outside Detroit, and as a kid, my family did not go into Detroit. Detroit was dangerous. People talk about bad places full of bad people. People say, in the neighborhood, guns have become the preferred method of dispute resolution. And my progressive friends, unfortunately, I think, can be worse about this than anything else. In their good intentions, they say things like, we've got to get to all the boys before they're 8 because otherwise they're lost. No, they're not. That's not true. And I get myself in trouble for saying what I'm about to say. So let me emphasize what I'm not saying. I am not saying that the community has not been horribly abused in all sorts of ways. So if you are in a black and brown neighborhood in the United States, you have been the victim of racism, of horrible abuse under color of law, of white supremacy, of neglect, of oppression, of redlining, of bad schools, of food deserts, of lack of economic opportunity. That's all true. What is also true is that despite that, and in the face of that reality, with no help from the outside, communities raise their kids and engage with each other and govern themselves so that in the place that people say is a bad place full of bad people, almost none of the young men grow up to be in that high-risk world. And we now know, some of you always knew, some of the rest of us have learned, once again, most of them are more scared and traumatized and at risk than they are predatory. We're going to be hearing from folks from the Urban Institute later on. The Urban Institute's done statistically valid social survey research in some of the hottest crime areas around the country, and they consistently find that the people who live in those places respect the law, they want to be safe, they want a good relationship with law enforcement, they don't trust the police, which is a problem, but they don't like the violence, they are not settling their disputes with guns, and almost all the 8-year-olds grow up not to be violent or to hurt somebody else. The notion that people have that these are bad places full of bad people is empirically wrong. It's not true. And I think the people in this room and our friends and networks are in a unique position now to drive a public conversation that says, this isn't right. Don't talk about these neighborhoods this way anymore. It's not the truth. And the National Network is also committed to driving the public discourse on that. So this is our next 2 days. We have worked to organize this conference around those ideas. And rather than having, for example, panels that have a number of people talking about their programs, we've tried to bring out these themes. And we've got groups that are talking about how to identify and work with the high risk, what support and outreach really means, how to do effective and minimal law enforcement, how to address trauma, and about both the nature of the affected community, what those strengths are, and how to get people who don't get it now to get it. I am so pleased you're here. And I hope this makes sense to you, and I'm looking forward to an unusually exciting and productive next 2 days. Thank you very much.